The document sits open on the desk. No one is watching. No deadline exists, no employer is waiting, no family member has asked for an explanation. The decision is yours alone, and yet the first fully formed response that arrives belongs to someone who has not been in the room for years. Before you have weighed a single practical consideration, before you have checked a single number or spoken a single word aloud, their verdict enters. The chair they once occupied is long empty, the relationship altered or dissolved or simply overtaken by time. The vote arrives anyway. Introduction. What you just recognized is not a ghost and not a wound. It is an architecture, a private internal gallery whose seats were filled over years of observation, correction, praise, silence, and consequence, and whose occupants no longer need to be physically present to cast their judgments. Each seat carries a nameplate. Some belong to parents. Others belong to former partners, old employers, religious communities, teachers, professional peers, or entire social classes. A few belong to earlier versions of yourself, holding opinions you declared with great certainty and have since quietly outgrown. The gallery is not unusual. Everyone carries one. What varies is how much authority it still holds over decisions being made today. Influence survives direct contact because it does not live in the person who once exercised it. It lives in the standards and predictions that person's reactions installed over time. A parent does not need to be alive to shape a career choice. A former partner does not need to be in the same city to shape how vulnerability is managed in a new relationship. A religious institution does not need to remain a daily presence to determine which ambitions feel permissible and which feel shameful. The standards migrated inward long ago, and they now operate as internal decision rules, anticipating verdicts, organizing preferences, editing possibilities before they reach full consideration. Remembering someone is not the same as granting that person authority. The gallery confuses the two. This record is a manual for that confusion. What follows will not teach you to resent the people whose names appear on those seats, nor to perform a dramatic rejection of everything that shaped you. Some of what the gallery holds is genuinely worth keeping. The task is more precise than revolution. Identify which voices are present, examine what authority each voice actually holds today, distinguish the ones offering valuable testimony from the ones exercising power they no longer have grounds to claim, and return the final vote to the self that is here now, the one living in present conditions, bearing present consequences, and responsible for the actual outcome. The gallery is real. The question is, who controls its ballot box? Chapter 1. How a witness becomes a voter. Long before any conscious reckoning with approval, there was a simpler arrangement. A person existed, behaved, and others responded. A parent looked pleased or fell silent. A teacher wrote a comment at the top of a page. An older sibling laughed at the dinner table or did not laugh. These were not calculated systems of manipulation. They were ordinary environments of evaluation, the kind every person inhabits and requires in order to learn what matters, what threatens, and what earns continued belonging. The applause and the correction were both forms of information, and the child, then the adolescent, then the young adult, gathered that information with remarkable efficiency. Praise has a particular effect on behavior. When an action produces warmth, recognition, or visible satisfaction in the people whose judgment carries weight, the action becomes easier to repeat. Not because the person reasons through the dynamic, but because reward embeds pattern. The student who receives genuine delight from a parent over academic achievement begins to experience that domain as a place where the self is legible and accepted. The person who is told repeatedly that they are good under pressure begins organizing their behavior around remaining calm in visible ways, whether or not the pressure is internally felt. Approval teaches strategy long before it becomes philosophy. Correction operates with equal force, though its stamp is different. Where praise draws behavior forward, correction marks certain directions as costly. This is not only punishment, it is the quiet withdrawal of warmth, the sigh, the brief look of disappointment, the comparison with a sibling who managed differently. The cost registered is not always pain. Often it is simply the removal of belonging, the sense that this version of you is less welcome than the one who behaved correctly. Over time, The smart adaptation is to predict the correction before the behavior occurs, to run the internal calculation in advance and stop the movement before it enters visible space. Prediction is learned economy. Once a person can anticipate which actions will be received poorly, the anticipation begins doing the work formerly done by external response. The teacher does not need to mark a failing grade if the student has already decided the essay is not worth attempting. The parent does not need to express disappointment if the adult child has already chosen the safer career before anyone asked. Prediction reduces exposure. It keeps belonging intact for a period in which the original authorities had real power over real conditions: shelter, approval, educational access, safety. This adaptation was reasonable and often necessary. The adaptation becomes complicated when it persists into conditions where its original logic no longer applies. The authority loses its direct power over outcomes. The child becomes an adult with independent resources, a separate address, a different life. But the internal predictive machinery does not automatically update with the changed conditions. It continues running its original calculations, now against audiences who may no longer be watching, against standards that were formed in a different decade, against verdicts whose consequences exist only in imagination. The audience exits the room. The system does not notice. At this point, something subtle happens. The person is no longer performing for an audience that is physically present and actively evaluating. They are performing for a remembered audience whose reactions are now generated entirely by their own internal model. The audience has become a character, a consistent, imagined presence that can be predicted, rehearsed against, and privately appeased. The question the original authority once answered, "Will this be approved?" has become the question the viewer now asks on the absent authority's behalf, using a model of that authority assembled from years of exposure. The live feedback loop has become a stored program. That stored program is what this record calls a vote. The program is not a memory. It is not a value. It is an installed behavioral rule dressed in the emotional weight of the relationship that created it. It arrives before evidence, before deliberation, before the practical facts of the current situation. Guidance is a transaction appropriate to the moment of formation and the conditions of genuine dependency. What remains afterward, still shaping choices in a different decade under different circumstances, for a different version of the person, that is something that requires examination. The mechanism deepens when repeated approval attaches not to a specific behavior, but to a description of the self. To be called intelligent, dependable, respectable, modest, spiritually faithful, or the strong one is to receive something more durable than praise for an action. It is to receive a classification, a story about who you are, offered by people whose opinion organized your early world. Classifications are efficient. They tell you in advance which behaviors fit and which create friction. They also create an audience with a permanent investment in the consistency of that description. Every classification has witnesses. The grandmother who said you were the responsible one was not only commenting on a moment, she was assigning a role with an expected performance. The teacher who identified you as a natural leader was not only observing capacity, she was extending an identity that required maintenance. The community that recognized you as spiritually steadfast was not only affirming practice, it was creating a record against which deviation would register as betrayal. The witnesses become invested in the categories they named, and the named person becomes invested in their continued recognition. When someone deeply embedded in the viewer's identity formation disapproves of a choice, the experience is not simply disagreement. It registers as a disruption of the established narrative, as if the protagonist of a known story has wandered into an unauthorized plot. This is why choices that seem minor from the outside can produce a disproportionate internal response. Changing careers after years in an expected field feels like more than a professional adjustment. Leaving a religious community after lifelong membership feels like more than a change in practice. The weight is not proportional to the practical stakes. It is proportional to how much of the identity was built around being the kind of person who does not do these things, and how many original witnesses would interpret the change as contradiction. The practical consequence is visible in the filtering that occurs before major decisions. Career choices are measured not only against salary, meaning and capability, but against how the choice will read to the audience that assigned the original description. A person identified as successful filters out options that could be read as failure. A person identified as humble filters out options that could be read as arrogance. A person identified as the reliable one filters out any movement that could be read as abandonment. The filter is not checked against current evidence. It is checked against the imagined reaction of the original witness, who may not have been consulted, who may no longer be in contact, and who may have changed their own views entirely. Consider a career held past the point of genuine engagement, because leaving it would require admitting publicly that the person has changed, that the identity the institution recognized is no longer accurate. The person is not staying because the work remains satisfying or the income necessary. They are staying because departure would require dissolving a description that a particular audience learned to approve. The audience may be a parent who expressed pride at the job offer 20 years ago. They may be a professional community that assigned the person a respected role. They may simply be a younger version of the self who made the decision with great confidence and would need to be contradicted. The chair is empty. The vote is not. Maintaining a family role operates on the same mechanism. The person who is the reliable one continues absorbing requests, managing crises, and foregoing their own adjustments, not because they have actively chosen that role in the present, but because stepping back from it would disappoint an internal model of the family that expects it. The role may have been appropriate at a time when resources were genuinely scarce, and the family's stability depended on someone holding it. Whether that remains true now is a different question, one the role itself prevents being asked cleanly because asking it feels like disloyalty. There is a critical distinction between possessing a value and performing an approved identity. A person who genuinely values discipline acts differently when unobserved than when the original authority would approve. They structure their behavior for functional reasons, not narrative ones. A person performing an approved identity calibrates their behavior against the description they were assigned and feels anxiety not when the behavior is ineffective, but when it might fail to be recognized as the correct identity. The test is interior. Does the decision feel right because it serves present life, or because it would read correctly to the audience that named you? Whose name appears on the gallery seat underneath each major description you still carry? The question is not asked to create resentment toward the people who named you. It is asked because a label can outlast the authority of the one who assigned it, and a person can spend decades maintaining an identity for an audience that stopped watching, or changed their own opinion, or would no longer recognize the behavior as the tribute it was intended to be. The next task is to examine the credentials of the authorities whose chairs still occupy the gallery, to ask what granted them authority in the first place, and whether those grounds still apply. Chapter 2. The credentials of authority. Among the people who shaped early decisions, there is usually at least one whose influence carries a particular kind of weight. Not because they possessed expertise and not because their judgment proved consistently accurate, but because the relationship was formative and the emotional stakes of their approval were very high. This is the authority of love. It is real. It produced genuine standards, genuine care, and in many cases, genuine benefit. It also operates as a confounding factor in any credential review because emotional significance and decision-making authority are not the same thing, and the confusion between them is among the most durable sources of absent voter power. When a relationship carries deep emotional meaning, disagreement becomes costly in a way that has nothing to do with whether the disagreement is factually correct. The cost is relational. The fear that contradiction will be read as rejection, that choosing differently will be interpreted as an indictment of the person whose guidance is being set aside. This emotional cost inflates the authority of the loved person beyond the domain of their actual competence. A parent may have navigated their own professional context with great skill and may have also passed genuine wisdom about character. Neither of those qualifications makes them the appropriate final authority on a career path that exists in a different industry, requires different trade-offs, and involves a version of the self the parent encountered only at its earlier stages. Care and concern extend toward many situations, but they do not automatically create expertise within them. A parent who worries about a child's financial security genuinely worries, and that worry deserves acknowledgement. It does not create knowledge about the industry, the opportunity, the contract terms, the person's capabilities, or the actual risk profile of the decision. Gratitude can honor the care without surrendering the evaluation. What makes the distinction difficult is that accepting the concern as information and accepting it as jurisdiction feel nearly identical when the relationship is emotionally significant. The felt experience of disappointing a loved person can be indistinguishable from the sense that one is making a mistake. Over time, gratitude can calcify into permanent obedience. The adult who received genuine advantage through a parent's guidance, sacrifice, or resources carries a real obligation to acknowledge that debt. Acknowledgement is not the same as lifelong subscription to the parent's preferred choices. The relationship can be honored, the debt recognized, the care remembered, and the final decision still made on present grounds without that representing ingratitude or betrayal. The emotional experience of separation may be uncomfortable regardless. Grief, guilt, anxiety, and the particular loneliness of choosing without the approval you were shaped to seek are real responses. They are not reliable evidence that the choice is wrong. What grants authority legitimately if not love? Competence in the relevant domain is one criterion. Present information is another. Actual consequences, the experience of bearing real outcomes from the decision, is a third. A loved person may possess some of these and not others. They may have excellent historical knowledge of your capabilities, but no current information about your present circumstances. They may have deep expertise in one field and none in the one being considered. They may care about your well-being but face none of the consequences of your choice. These distinctions matter when authority is being reviewed, not to diminish the relationship, but to ask precisely what role it should play. The question that deserves an honest answer is this: in the decision currently under consideration, does this person have current information, relevant competence, and present consequence? If the answer is yes to all three, their input belongs near the center. If the answer is partial or negative, the emotional weight of the relationship should not compensate for the missing credentials. Their concern may still deserve acknowledgement. Their testimony may still carry useful content. But concern and testimony are not the same as the right to govern the outcome. That distinction between someone mattering deeply and someone possessing the final vote is among the most difficult to maintain and among the most necessary. Most gallery conflicts are not resolved by logic alone, because the authority being challenged was never installed through logic. It was installed through relationship, repetition, and emotional consequence. Recognizing that a loved person holds authority beyond their credentials is not an intellectual exercise. It is a form of internal renegotiation that may involve genuine grief, the grief of growing into a self that requires decisions the original witnesses would not all endorse. That grief does not mean the renegotiation is wrong. Beyond the intimate relationships, the gallery holds a category of authority whose power came not from love, but from position. Teachers who assessed your capacity at 17. An early employer whose review shaped how you described your own competence. A clergy member or spiritual director who named what was acceptable within a tradition you have since left, modified, or grown past. A professional institution whose standards formed the frame through which your entire field understood legitimate practice. These were not relationships primarily organized around love. They were relationships organized around rank, and rank, while real within its original context, is among the most easily confused with permanent jurisdiction. The judgments these authorities issued once carried genuine consequences. A negative review from an early employer affected how future opportunities were pursued. A teacher's assessment of your mathematical mind made certain options feel inaccessible at the very age when options were being organized into life trajectories. Her religious community's definition of acceptable behavior carried social and sometimes material consequences that made deviation genuinely costly. The authority was not imaginary. The consequences were real. The mind learned to recognize the signals of that authority and respond to them with appropriate urgency. The problem is that the mind tends to preserve rank even after the conditions that made the rank consequential have ended. The teacher who assessed your capacity has no current knowledge of your present capabilities. 3 decades of experience, deliberate skill building, and hard-won competence have intervened. The employer who wrote the review operated in a context that may no longer exist, under assumptions that may have proven inaccurate, evaluating a version of you at a relatively early developmental stage. The religious institution, whose standards feel binding, may no longer have any material power over your professional life, your social circle, or your day-to-day environment. The authority continues operating internally, long after its external consequences have expired. Rank authority is particularly persistent when the original context assigned it in formal terms. An official credential, a grade, a performance review, a formal pronouncement within a community, carries a ceremonial weight that informal correction often does not. The document feels like a record. Records feel authoritative in a way that casual opinion does not. The mind treats a formal assessment from a former authority as if it were a sealed verdict still in force, rather than a document produced under specific conditions that no longer obtain. The expired badge sits in the drawer, but it still affects how the wearer moves through rooms. The relevant tests are straightforward, even if applying them requires discipline. Does this authority have current information about your actual capabilities, circumstances, and choices? Does it understand the present conditions under which the decision is being made? Does it bear any of the consequences of the outcome? Does it occupy a role that gives it legitimate standing in the domain being evaluated? Former authorities who cannot answer yes to at least some of these questions are operating on expired credentials, and the gallery that houses them is maintaining, at real cost, an institutional hierarchy that no longer governs actual life. None of this requires a dramatic repudiation of the institution or the individual. A teacher who formed your early self-concept about intelligence did something real and formative, even if that formation requires revision. The recognition that their assessment was limited by context, time, and the particular version of you they encountered is not an attack on the relationship. It is a factual observation. The conditions that made the assessment authoritative have changed, and the assessment therefore carries weight only as a historical document, not as a current credential. The formal acknowledgement of that limit is part of what this record calls a credential review, and it belongs at the beginning of any honest audit of the gallery. That audit begins by naming every chair. Before credentials can be reviewed, the occupants must be identified. Not all of them are immediately obvious. Some seats are held by collective voices rather than individual authorities, by cultures, classes, professions, and communities whose standards operated as ambient pressure rather than explicit instruction. And some seats are held by earlier versions of the viewer themselves, maintaining the authority of declarations made with certainty at moments that may no longer represent current understanding. The next section examines each of those categories in turn. Chapter 3: 4 Absent Voters. The first category of gallery occupant is the original authority, the parents, guardians, primary teachers, and formative leaders who held genuine power over early life. Their authority was not theoretical. They controlled access to safety, resources, education, belonging, and self-description during the period when those things were entirely outside the child's independent reach. What they approved shaped the available paths. What they disapproved created real consequences. Because the relationship with an original authority is formed before the self has developed any external frame of reference for comparison, their standards arrive not as one opinion among many, but as something closer to the structure of reality itself. This is why their voice, decades later, often carries the tone of fact rather than perspective. The language of original authority tends toward the categorical. It speaks in terms of how people like us behave, what a good person does, what success looks like, what can be risked and what must be protected. These are not merely instructions. They are inherited definitions of legitimacy, the standards against which choices will be measured before any practical consideration is applied. A person raised with a very specific definition of what constitutes a respectable life will evaluate career changes, relationship structures, geographic mobility, and financial decisions against that definition automatically, regardless of whether the definition fits their present circumstances or their genuinely chosen values. The useful inheritance that original authorities leave is real. Discipline, care, loyalty, a capacity for sustained effort, a sense of moral obligation, these are not constructions to be discarded wholesale. The question is not whether the original authority shaped you, but which elements of that shaping remain chosen and which remain only compelled. Safety as an inherited standard may still be genuinely valued. Respectability as a definition may no longer match the conditions of a life the original authority could not have anticipated. Separating the principles that survive honest examination from the controls that operate only through accumulated emotional weight is the precise work of this category's audit. The emotional difficulty with original authority is proportional to the attachment. Reviewing a parent's jurisdiction feels qualitatively different from reviewing a former employer's because the parent was present at the formation of the self before the self had any distance from which to evaluate. The review is not a rejection of the relationship. It is the completion of a developmental process that healthy relationships encourage, but that unexamined authority can interrupt. The process of becoming the primary interpreter of your own life, carrying the inheritance consciously rather than unconsciously obeying it. The second category operates through closeness rather than rank. Former partners, close friends, and trusted confidants gain access to parts of the self that institutional authority rarely reaches. They know the private fears, the inconsistencies between stated values and actual behavior, the moments when confidence was performative and when uncertainty was carefully managed. This proximity gives their assessments an authority that feels different from anything available to an authority who only ever saw the public version. A verdict from someone who knew the interior, even one delivered years ago, even one that was inaccurate, carries an evidentiary weight that external opinions simply cannot match. The particular power of a former intimate's judgment lies in its apparent intimacy. When a former partner said you were too closed off or too selfish or impossible to please, the statement arrived with what felt like insider knowledge. The accusation used material gathered from private access. This is what makes it so durable. It bypasses the usual defense that the critic simply does not know you well enough. They did know you. The assessment, whatever its accuracy, was not formed in ignorance. This is why former intimate verdicts can install themselves in the gallery with unusual depth and stay there through subsequent relationships, shaping how the person manages vulnerability, assesses their own behavior, and anticipates the reaction of new partners who had nothing to do with the original assessment. The distinction that matters here is between a verdict and a sentence. A verdict is an assessment of a specific behavior within specific relational conditions. A sentence is an identity label applied as a permanent classification. When a former intimate said the behavior in question was selfish, they were potentially offering a verdict about an interaction, a pattern, or a period in the relationship. When that verdict becomes the internal understanding that you are selfish as an enduring fact, a gallery label that governs how every subsequent relationship is navigated, it has been converted from testimony into identity sentencing. The conversion was made internally, usually under the emotional intensity of the relationship's most difficult period, and it was not reviewed when conditions changed. Distinguishing accurate feedback from identity sentencing requires returning to the specific claim. What observable behavior did the assessment describe? Under what relational conditions did it occur? Was the verdict an accurate characterization of a recurring pattern, or was it conflict language produced by a person also in distress? These are not comfortable questions. They require honesty about the behavior in question, neither automatic self-defense nor automatic acceptance of the verdict at full identity weight. The gallery does not benefit from replacing one extreme with another. The third category holds authority without a single identifiable face. A professional class, a religious community, a social neighborhood, a family culture, and an ethnic or class tradition can all exercise strong evaluative pressure without any one member of the group explicitly casting a verdict. The standard exists in the ambient expectations of belonging, in what is understood without needing to be stated, about which choices are appropriate for someone of this background, this education, this family, this community. When an individual from such a context considers a departure from those expectations, the gallery fills not with one specific voice, but with a collective murmur that is harder to locate and therefore harder to examine. Collective authority is durable precisely because it lacks a single point of accountability. When a parent or former partner holds a gallery seat, it is possible to recall actual statements and actual relationships and subject them to examination. When a professional culture or religious tradition holds a seat, the authority disperses into ambient assumptions that feel less like someone's opinion and more like the nature of things. The collective voice says that serious people do not leave stable careers for uncertain creative work, or that people of faith do not abandon tradition without losing their moral grounding, or that people from this kind of family simply do not discuss certain things publicly. And these statements arrive with the force of shared reality rather than the force of argument. Alongside the collective, the gallery holds a vote cast by the viewer's own past self. This voter is among the most underestimated. An earlier version of you made declarations about identity, values, relationships, and certainties that the present self has quietly outgrown. The past self's vote operates as a commitment to internal consistency. Changing course feels like admitting that the earlier certainty was wrong, and admitting that feels like undermining the authority of your own judgment. People can remain in careers, relationships, and belief systems far past the point of genuine alignment, not because the current evidence supports remaining, but because leaving would require acknowledging that a former self was confidently mistaken. The gallery of past selves can be as binding as the gallery of former authorities. Taken together, these four categories, original authority, former intimate, collective, and past self, account for most of the invisible population occupying the internal gallery. What makes each category distinct is not only its source, but the kind of standard it enforces and the kind of examination it requires. Before a credential review can be conducted, the language of each voter must be recognized. The next section examines how absent authority makes itself heard in ordinary deliberation. Chapter 4. The language from the empty chairs. The gallery does not remain silent. It communicates through sentences, short, declarative, often categorical, that arrive during deliberation as if they were simply observations about reality. They are not observations. They are verdicts, translated through years of internalization into the register of apparent fact. The first task of recognition is to learn to hear these sentences for what they are. The preserved language of an absent authority whose capacity to actually evaluate the present situation is significantly limited. Among the most recognizable is the sentence of categorical exclusion. People like us do not do that. This construction does not provide a reason. It does not offer evidence. It asserts membership criteria and implies that the action being considered falls outside the boundary of the identity being maintained. The sentence ends inquiry before inquiry begins. It transforms a decision into a loyalty test, and in doing so, it displaces present reasoning with historical classification. Whose vocabulary uses this construction? The answer usually points directly to a gallery seat. Close beside it is the sentence of irreversible sacrifice. You are throwing everything away. This verdict treats an established pattern, a career, a marriage, a community, a set of accumulated choices, as a single unified investment that cannot survive any significant revision without complete loss. The logic forbids updating. It insists that any departure from the established trajectory destroys what preceded it, which is rarely accurate and even more rarely the actual issue. The sentence's real function is to activate the fear that accompanies major change and associate that fear with error, regardless of whether the evidence supports the association. The sentence that belongs specifically to collective authority arrives as a surveillance report. What will people think? This verdict does not name a specific person, which is part of its power. The imagined audience is always large enough to be significant and specific enough to be plausible. The sentence redirects attention from the quality of the choice to its appearance, from whether it serves present life to whether it can be successfully managed as a public-facing narrative. Choices evaluated primarily through this sentence are being made for an audience rather than for the person living with the consequences. Then there are the identity maintenance sentences. You have always been the responsible one. You were never good at that kind of risk. That is not who you are. These verdicts use historical description as binding prescription. They treat an observation about past behavior as a governing rule about future behavior, and they imply that departure from the pattern represents a breach of the self rather than its legitimate development. The key test for any sentence in this category is whether it contains information or only produces obedience. A sentence that cannot be translated into specific, observable, testable claims is functioning as enforcement rather than evidence. What these sentences share is their syntax of finality. They do not ask questions. They do not present arguments. They arrive already concluded, and their rhetorical function is to make the conclusion feel like a recognition of reality rather than a judgment that requires examination. Inquiry is their enemy, which is precisely why hearing them for what they are is the essential first step. Once a verdict sentence is recognized as the preserved language of an absent authority rather than a neutral description of current conditions, its automatic power diminishes. It does not disappear, but it can be examined. Asking whose vocabulary a sentence resembles is among the most direct diagnostic tools available. The construction people like us belongs to a specific cultural formation. The word irresponsible, applied in a particular context, carries a particular voice's inflection. The phrase throwing everything away has a specific emotional quality drawn from a specific relationship. Locating the source does not neutralize the sentence's content. It may contain real concern, but it clarifies the question of authority. This language belongs to a specific person or community operating under specific conditions, and its application to the current situation deserves the same scrutiny any other opinion would receive. Not all verdict sentences announce themselves as verdicts. Some arrive as rhetorical questions with a single implied answer. "Are you really doing this?" carries a particular tone. "Do you really think that will work?" carries another. These constructions preserve the illusion of open inquiry while delivering a closed verdict. Recognizing the implied answer and asking whether that answer is based on current evidence is the beginning of translation. Before the overt sentence can be addressed, however, the gallery exercises a subtler influence. It operates not only through language, but through a face. Not every absent voter announces their presence through sentences. Some operate through the remembered configuration of a face, a particular silence, a specific expression, a sigh of a very particular kind. The mind has catalogued these non-verbal responses from years of proximity, and it can reproduce them with considerable precision in the context of a deliberation. Imagining the quiet disappointment of a parent, the particular closed expression of a former partner, or the collective stillness of a community that has just received unwelcome news can carry evaluative weight, comparable to any explicit statement. This is influence at its most intimate and least examinable. Nonverbal memories become decision cues when they are associated with the experience of having chosen wrongly. The expression was present during a moment of correction or disapproval. Its subsequent appearance in imagination triggers the same emotional register: the contraction, the internal apology, the impulse to revise whatever prompted the association. The person is not reasoning from the memory. They are responding to it in the same way they would respond to a present social signal, despite the fact that the signal is being generated entirely by internal processes from historical material. Consider a career disclosure imagined in advance. Before any conversation has occurred, before any information has been exchanged, the person has already produced an internal version of the disclosure and generated the anticipated response, the expression, the silence, the tone, in enough detail to produce a genuine emotional reaction. That reaction influences the decision. Whether the disclosure is worth pursuing, whether the direction is worth continuing, whether the person can withstand the imagined evaluation. These questions are being answered partly through a conversation that exists only in simulation. The simulation may be based on accurate historical pattern. It may also be significantly outdated. The first question that challenges this mechanism is whether the simulation is current. People change. Relationships accumulate new context. The parent who responded to a career choice with visible disappointment 20 years ago may have developed substantially different views through their own experiences since then. The former partner, whose expression became a template for anticipated rejection, was formed within the specific conditions of that relationship and may bear little resemblance to that person's actual present perspective or to the perspective of any future person in the viewer's life. The remembered face is a still from a longer film, accurate within its moment, and no longer necessarily representative. The second question is more structural. Even if the simulation were entirely accurate, even if the actual person would respond precisely as imagined, should that response govern the decision? This is the question that separates testimony from jurisdiction. An accurate prediction of another person's reaction is useful information, particularly when that person has genuine stakes in the outcome. It is not an automatic veto. The person whose face is being rehearsed may disagree for reasons that remain their own, reasons rooted in their own formation, their own fears, their own investments in a particular version of the viewer's life. Accurate prediction of that disagreement is not evidence that the choice is wrong. It is evidence only that the choice may generate a particular reaction in a particular person, which is a separate matter entirely. What complicates the nonverbal mechanism is that it can be mistaken for intuition. The internal contraction that accompanies the imagined expression feels like a warning signal from the body, not like a conditioned response. When the distinction between intuition and conditioned reaction is unclear, when the uneasy feeling accompanying a choice could plausibly be either a genuine read of present conditions or an inherited pattern misapplied to new ones, the only honest response is further investigation rather than immediate compliance or immediate dismissal. The unease is real. Its source requires examination. The patterns of absent voter language and imagined faces operate most powerfully in specific situations, moments when the identity being maintained faces genuine threat, when change is visible, when the gap between the gallery's preferred narrative and the actual life being lived becomes difficult to obscure. Those situations and the way they make the gallery suddenly crowded deserve their own examination. Chapter 5. When the gallery fills, the gallery's population becomes loudest at the threshold, during stable periods, when established patterns continue and no significant change is being considered. The absent voters remain relatively quiet because the current behavior already satisfies their preferred narrative. It is the moment of potential departure that fills the seats. A retirement being considered, a relocation in planning stages, a relationship ending or beginning, a belief system under revision, a career that no longer fits the person inhabiting it. Transitions threaten the existing description, and it is description that the gallery is organized to protect. The reason transitions activate old authority is structural. Every established role carries a social identity, a description legible to a particular audience. The career establishes the professional identity. The geographic location connects the person to a community that knows them in a specific way. The religious affiliation places the person within a tradition whose members share certain understandings. When the role changes, the identity becomes temporarily unreadable. The gallery responds to that illegibility as if it were danger, and the response takes the form of absent voters, reasserting the standards that made the old identity coherent. Take a person approaching retirement who continues working past genuine readiness. The work may no longer be engaging, the physical or emotional cost may have become significant, and the desire to reorganize time around different priorities may be clearly present. The delay is not primarily about income, although it may be framed that way. The delay is about what the work represents. For a particular family in a particular generation, with a particular set of witnesses, sustained professional activity was the evidence of worth. Retirement threatens the description. The gallery fills with the original authority, who equated work with value, and the verdict arrives before the practical calculation is complete. A relationship change generates a different version of the same activation. Leaving a marriage, entering a new relationship, disclosing a relationship structure to family or community, these choices require the person to revise the narrative that specific audiences know. The audiences may be a family whose values are clear, a religious community with explicit positions, a professional circle where a particular social profile was understood. The anticipation of those audiences' reactions can delay a necessary change for years, keeping a person inside conditions that have become genuinely harmful simply because the transition would require being seen in the process of departure. A sentence appears in the internal rehearsal just before action becomes real. It tends toward the catastrophic. This will destroy everything I have built, or they will never understand, or I cannot explain this without losing the relationship entirely. This sentence functions as a narrative emergency brake. It converts the anticipated difficulty of transition into the apparent inevitability of catastrophe, and it arrives just at the moment when continuation has become most costly. Recognizing the sentence as a gallery verdict, rather than a factual prediction, is the primary diagnostic skill the transition demands. Not every transition is desirable, and the gallery's concern is not always misdirected. Some transitions carry genuine risk. Some changes involve real loss of things worth protecting. The gallery's alarm is not always wrong in its identification of stakes. It is frequently wrong in its claim to authority over the final decision. The distinction between useful warning and expired veto can be made only after the warning has been heard as testimony rather than as verdict. The seats are filling. The next question is, what happens when the situation involves visible success or visible failure? Success has a complicated relationship with the gallery. The expectation would be that achievement silences the absent audience, because achievement appears to confirm the categories they valued. In practice, certain kinds of success activate a different set of gallery responses. Significant advancement beyond what the original audience achieved, movement into domains they considered unsuitable, or public recognition in an area they did not understand or value. These can trigger the very voices that approval was supposed to satisfy. The gallery seat holds a voter who expected success only of a particular kind, and unexpected success reads as a departure from the original script. The specific fear that success sometimes produces is the fear of appearing to have abandoned the people or community from which the person came, of becoming someone whose success implicitly comments on those who did not achieve the same. The person who exceeds their original context may find that the gallery fills not with angry voters, but with mournful or reproachful ones, the ones who invested in a particular version of the person and now feel that the version has moved beyond reach. The success itself creates a disclosure problem. Sharing it honestly would require acknowledging a departure. Minimizing it would require performing a modesty that misrepresents actual conditions. The gallery produces an audience for whom no announcement of the success is quite right. Failure activates a different register of the gallery, but an equally powerful one. When a project fails, a business closes, a relationship ends badly, or a risk taken with confidence produces a poor outcome. The gallery responds by producing its most difficult residents, the ones who warned against the choice, the ones whose verdict was, "I told you this would not work," the ones whose predictions of limitation or irresponsibility can now be read as apparently confirmed. The failure does not merely produce practical consequences, it produces an imagined courtroom in which every seat is occupied by someone who saw this coming, and the viewer is required to explain themselves. The internal dynamics of this courtroom are worth examining precisely because they can be more painful than the practical consequences of the failure itself. An investment that did not produce the expected return can be recovered from. The experience of feeling that a lifelong pattern of judgment has been confirmed, that the gallery voters who doubted your capacity were right, can organize subsequent decisions for years. The person who internalizes the verdict, "This proved I was not capable of this," may not be hearing an accurate summary of the evidence. They may be hearing the gallery's preferred reading of a complex outcome translated into a simple identity conclusion. Disclosure is the moment when the gallery's power becomes most explicit. Before the announcement of a choice, the internal audience is managing its verdicts in simulation. Once the choice is disclosed to actual people, the simulation becomes reality, and the person discovers whether the anticipated reactions were accurate. What happens before that disclosure is often diagnostic. Choices made primarily to avoid a particular person's reaction, announcements drafted and redrafted, not to provide information, but to preemptively answer the gallery's expected verdicts, decisions delayed until a particular voice is no longer in a position to comment. The choice is hidden from one specific person, regardless of their practical effect on that person, are revealing indicators of gallery authority. The distinction that clarifies this pattern is between privacy and shame-based concealment. Privacy protects information whose disclosure would serve no legitimate purpose, whose audience has no genuine stake, and whose absence causes no harm. Shame-based concealment withholds information to avoid the experience of being seen choosing in a way that the gallery would not endorse. The information may be entirely benign. The other person may be entirely unaffected. The concealment exists solely to avoid the imagined verdict, and its presence is evidence that the voter is actively governing behavior. The test is direct. Would this decision remain difficult if no one needed to be told? If the answer is no, if the decision is clear in private and becomes complicated only in contemplation of disclosure, the complication belongs to the gallery, not to the choice itself. Chapter 6. The price of an absent audience. The long-term consequence of organized absent voter influence is not a single dramatic wrong turn. It accumulates through thousands of small editorial decisions, each individually defensible, collectively producing a life whose primary coherence is narrative rather than experiential. The life looks coherent to observers who understand its frame, the established career, the expected address, the appropriate relationship, the recognizable social positioning. What is less visible is the degree to which the life was assembled primarily for readability rather than for inhabitability, for what it would mean to the gallery rather than for what it would feel like to live inside. The presentable life is distinguished from the satisfying life by a specific kind of private misalignment. Externally, the choices form a plausible and even admirable sequence. The career follows a logical arc. The home is maintained at the right standard. The relationships fit the expected structure. Internally, however, a significant portion of daily experience feels like performance, like occupying a role that was cast by an external process rather than inhabited from genuine choice. The person can explain every decision clearly and correctly to anyone who asks. What they cannot always explain is why the explanations feel more compelling than the experience of living the decisions out. Choices selected because they are defensible have a particular texture. They tend toward the established over the experimental, the legible over the idiosyncratic, the recognized category over the one that requires explanation. This is not always wrong. Legibility has genuine social value, and many established paths are established precisely because they work. The problem is the filtering process. When choices are primarily selected for their capacity to withstand scrutiny rather than for their fit with the person making them, the filtering excludes a significant range of options before they are evaluated on their own terms. Career offers declined because they would have required explaining a departure from the expected trajectory. Homes maintained at a size and standard oriented more toward the visiting impression of a specific person than toward the daily experience of its occupants. Marriages continued past genuine alignment because the structure of the relationship represented something to a particular audience. These are not small choices, they are the architecture of how a life is organized. When that architecture is shaped primarily by absent evaluation, the absence of any actual audience arriving to reward the sacrifice becomes a particular kind of loss. The gallery verdict was prepared for, and the gallery stayed empty. No one came to approve the cost. What is most striking about the presentable life is the frequency with which no approval arrives regardless. The original authority who shaped the expected trajectory may have died, moved on, lost interest, or never revisited the question of whether the expected choices were correct for this particular person in this particular life. The imagined verdict was prepared against an audience that has been absent for years, whose satisfaction was assumed rather than confirmed, whose standard was maintained not because it produced visible approval, but because its violation would have felt like abandonment. The presentable life is often built for an audience that stopped showing up long before the building stopped. The gap between the polished exterior and the private experience is not always dramatic. It can be a persistent low-level sense that something important was never allowed to be explored, not a catastrophic wrong turn, but a continuous background hum of unlived territory. That hum is the sound of the gallery's influence at its most diffuse. Not a single dramatic prohibition, but a steady editorial pressure that over time produces a life organized around its own explanation rather than its own experience. The most specific cost the gallery extracts is not what was done under absent voter influence. It is what was not done, the options dismissed before testing, the experiments abandoned before evidence could accumulate, the possibilities foreclosed by the imagined verdict rather than by actual investigation. These represent the unlived experiment, the territory that was never entered because the gallery's anticipated reaction was treated as a sufficient substitute for the exploration itself. The mechanism is precise. A possibility arises, a different professional direction, a relocation to a different context, a creative practice taken seriously, a relationship structure that departs from the expected form. Before any evidence is gathered, before any preliminary attempt is made, the internal gallery produces its verdict on the outcome. The verdict feels authoritative because it comes with the weight of an established relationship. The possibility is dismissed not because reality was tested and found inhospitable, but because the gallery predicted failure and the prediction was accepted as the result of a test that was never conducted. This is how absent voter authority perpetuates itself most insidiously, not through explicit prohibition, but through preemptive foreclosure. The teacher's assessment of limited mathematical capacity means the quantitative option is not investigated at an age when it might have been accessible. The parent's verdict that creative work is not a viable livelihood means the practice is kept private rather than developed seriously. The former partner's judgment that the person is not capable of sustained emotional intimacy means subsequent relationships are managed at a distance that confirms over time the original verdict, not because the verdict was accurate, but because it was obeyed. The absence of evidence for the alternative is then mistakenly interpreted as proof that the alternative was always unsuitable. Bounded experiments are the specific corrective to this pattern. A bounded experiment is not a dramatic life overhaul. It is a time-limited, reversible, low-cost test of a possibility that was previously dismissed without investigation. The person who was told they had no capacity for structured analytical thinking takes a single course rather than changes career. The person whose creative work was dismissed as impractical spends 3 months giving it serious, sustained time rather than making an immediate professional transition. The person whose relocation was described as abandonment takes an extended visit rather than committing to a permanent address change. The bounded experiment produces actual evidence that can be weighed against the inherited prediction rather than simply deferring to it. Real constraints deserve acknowledgement. Not every experiment is available. Financial obligations, dependent care, contractual commitments, and genuine physical limitations reduce the available range of experiments. The gallery often uses legitimate constraints as cover for its own authority. The real obstacle and the gallery prohibition can be difficult to distinguish when both are present. The honest separation requires asking whether the constraint is actual or whether it has been magnified by the anticipation of a specific verdict. This is not always a comfortable question, but the capacity to distinguish genuine limitation from gallery prohibition is essential to the process. The unlived experiment also involves a specific quality of grief. There is a particular kind of loss attached to the recognition that a territory was foreclosed before investigation, that an option was dismissed at an age when dismissal seemed final and authority seemed absolute. That grief deserves acknowledgement. It does not benefit from conversion into either bitterness toward the original authority or romanticization of the path not taken. The alternative was not simply better, it was untested. What deserves grief is the foreclosure, not the imagined certainty that the alternative would have been superior. Before the gallery can be audited honestly, however, the audit must establish what it is not: the ways in which influence, consultation, and shared consequence remain legitimate and should not be swept away in the name of self-determination. Chapter 7. What the gallery is not. The correction of absent voter influence is not a permission to dismiss every voice that arrives from someone other than the present self. That conclusion would replace one error with a different and equally costly one. The gallery's problem is not that it contains outside influence. Outside influence is legitimate, necessary, and often valuable. Its problem is that it grants governing authority to sources that no longer possess the grounds to exercise it. The corrective is not elimination of outside perspective. It is a precise distinction between testimony and a vote. Testimony in this framework is information. It is a perspective, a warning, a piece of relevant experience, an observation about the viewer's behavior from someone who had genuine access. Testimony may be entirely accurate. It may describe something real that deserves serious consideration. It does not by itself determine the outcome. A vote in the same framework is authority over the final decision, the power to determine which choice is legitimate. Testimony belongs to anyone with relevant information and a good faith concern. A vote belongs only to those who meet the specific criteria of present consequence, current information, relevant expertise, and legitimate relationship to the domain. Consider a parent who raises a genuine concern about a financial dimension of a major decision. The concern may be entirely well-founded. The parent may have direct experience with similar decisions, may understand the financial risks better than the viewer does at this moment, and may be articulating something that deserves careful attention. That concern, received as testimony, improves the quality of the decision. The same concern, received as a vote, as an authority capable of determining whether the choice is legitimate, converts useful information into external governance. The distinction is not about dismissing the parent, it is about the viewer retaining final authority while being genuinely improved by the information. Former mentors can provide domain expertise that remains valuable long after the mentoring relationship ended. A professional who worked closely with the viewer in an earlier stage of their career may have accurate observations about how the viewer performs under specific kinds of pressure, or where certain skill gaps tend to appear. This expertise does not expire simply because the working relationship ended. As testimony in a relevant decision, it deserves weight. As a vote, as the authority that determines whether the viewer may pursue a particular direction, it operates without current information about who the viewer has become through years of subsequent experience. Expertise and authority are different grants. The first belongs to the person who has relevant knowledge. The second belongs to the person bearing the consequences. The situation where expertise genuinely deserves increased weight is identifiable. When the stakes of the decision involve domains where specialized knowledge matters, medicine, law, structural finance, engineering, expert testimony belongs near the center of the deliberation regardless of who provides it. A physician's assessment of a treatment option carries authority in its domain. A financial advisor's analysis of a risk profile carries authority in its domain. The relationship between the viewer and the expert does not need to be emotionally significant for the testimony to carry appropriate weight. What makes these cases distinctive is that the expertise is current, domain-specific, and grounded in present conditions, not in historical relationship or institutional memory. Valuable testimony does not require surrender of the final decision. Receiving a concern genuinely, incorporating it honestly, and still choosing on the basis of one's own judgment is not a failure of respect. It is the appropriate management of outside input. The viewer who can do this has separated the emotional cost of disagreement from the epistemological question of who is better positioned to make the final call. These are distinct questions, and conflating them is exactly how gallery authority maintains itself, under the cover of appropriate consultation. Alongside the distinction between testimony and vote, there is a more direct category of present interest that the gallery review must not erase. Some people in the viewer's life are not absent voters operating through historical influence. They are current stakeholders, people whose present life is materially affected by the decision being made. The audit of the internal gallery must not be extended to dissolve obligations to people who are actually here, actually affected, and legitimately involved in the decision's consequences. A spouse who will bear financial consequences of a major career change is not a gallery voter. Their input belongs at the center of the deliberation. A dependent whose care arrangements are affected by a relocation deserves direct consideration as a present stakeholder, not as a member of an audience being managed. A contractual partner whose professional or financial position is materially tied to the decision has a legitimate present interest that cannot be classified as expired authority simply because their perspective might be inconvenient. These are different categories from the absent voter, and maintaining the distinction between them is a precondition for the audit being conducted honestly. The difference between a present stakeholder and an absent voter is material consequence. A stakeholder will bear a real, present, practical impact from the outcome. An absent voter produces only imagined evaluation. Their lives are not affected by what the viewer chooses. The parent who would prefer a different career trajectory is not a stakeholder in the career itself, unless the viewer's income directly supports the parent's well-being. The former partner whose anticipated reaction shapes how a new relationship is managed is not a stakeholder in the new relationship. The professional community whose norms create ambient pressure is not a stakeholder in the specific decision being considered. These are gallery occupants. Their distinction from present stakeholders is the primary line that keeps the audit from becoming a justification for ignoring legitimate obligation. Consultation, consent, and negotiation are the appropriate processes with present stakeholders. These are not the same as permission seeking from the gallery. Consulting a spouse before making a decision with major financial consequences is not the same as rehearsing an imaginary explanation for a parent. Negotiating the terms of a significant change with a person who will be directly affected is not the same as managing a former community's anticipated judgment. The former is shared decision-making among people with current stakes. The latter is the performance of an explanation for an absent audience with imagined jurisdiction. The procedures look similar from the outside. Both involve conversation about choices, but their structure and their purpose are entirely different. The relational context that distinguishes present stakeholders from gallery voters is not always immediately obvious. A living parent whose emotional reaction will be significant may or may not have genuine material stakes, depending on the specific decision. The question to ask is concrete. Whose daily life, financial position, physical safety, or direct relational security is affected by the outcome? Where the answer is yes, where another person will face tangible consequences, that person belongs not in the empty gallery, but at the current table. Where the answer is no, where the only consequence to another person is their emotional response to a choice that does not affect their practical life, that response belongs in the category of testimony, not governance. Having mapped these distinctions, the audit can now begin formally. Chapter 8. The Empty Gallery Audit. The audit begins with a single specific decision. Not a general pattern, not a recurring theme, not the broad question of identity or direction, one concrete choice that is currently open and to which the gallery's influence is being applied. Stating the decision in neutral language is itself a discipline. A decision stated as whether to leave this position occupies different internal territory than a decision stated as whether to betray everything this career was supposed to represent. The second formulation has already loaded the deliberation with gallery language. The neutral statement of the actual choice, the practical question being considered, provides the foundation for everything that follows. With the decision neutrally stated, the audit moves to identification. Every person, group, or voice whose anticipated reaction enters the deliberation belongs on the seating chart. This is not a selective list of the voters who seem most obviously problematic. It is a complete inventory, The parent, the former partner, the professional community, the religious tradition, the sibling, the former mentor, the deceased grandparent, the social class, the neighborhood, the culture. Each of these occupies a seat, whether or not the connection is conscious. The comprehensive inventory is important precisely because gallery influence is strongest in the seats that go unexamined, the ones whose presence is so habitual that it is mistaken for the viewer's own perspective. Include voters who are no longer living. The dead do not lose their gallery seats through death. A parent, grandparent, or mentor who died carrying specific standards may occupy a particularly durable seat precisely because the relationship was never updated by subsequent interaction. The imagined verdict of someone who died 20 years ago is still a gallery verdict, still a reaction generated from internal modeling rather than from current reality. Including deceased voters in the inventory does not diminish their memory. It simply acknowledges that their influence requires the same examination as any other gallery occupant. Include the viewer's past self among the inventory. This is often the most uncomfortable entry. The earlier version of you who made confident declarations about what you would never do, who you would never become, which values would never be compromised. That version occupies a real gallery seat and casts a real vote. The past self's verdict arrives as internal inconsistency, the feeling that a current consideration betrays a previous commitment. This voter is not an external authority, but they exercise authority, sometimes considerable authority, and they require the same credential review as anyone else on the seating chart. For each identified voter, record the specific feared sentence, not a general summary of the relationship's emotional quality, but the exact internal language the voter's verdict produces. She would say, "I am throwing away everything she worked for." He would see this as proof he was right about my instability. The community would read this as abandonment of faith. My former self would not recognize the person making this choice. These specific sentences, written plainly, expose the verdict's actual content and begin revealing how much of it is identity accusation versus how much is substantive claim. They also reveal whose vocabulary each sentence borrows, which is itself a primary piece of diagnostic information. Finally, for each voter and their associated verdict, note whether the reaction being anticipated is remembered, predicted, or currently known. Remembered reactions are based on actual past responses within the relationship. Predicted reactions are modeled from historical pattern without current confirmation. Currently known reactions have been recently expressed and verified through direct contact. The distinction matters for what comes next. Remembered reactions may have accumulated detail through years of internal amplification. Predicted reactions are entirely the viewer's construction. Currently known reactions may deserve more direct engagement. Before the correct response can be identified, the source of the information needs to be classified. The seating chart now contains names, roles, feared sentences, and source classifications. The credential review asks a specific sequence of questions about each seat. The questions are not rhetorical. They require honest, considered answers, and their answers will vary from voter to voter. The review does not begin with a predetermined conclusion about any specific relationship. It begins with a set of standards applied consistently. Does this voter have current information about the situation being decided? Current information means active knowledge of the viewer's present circumstances, present capabilities, present relationships, and present constraints. Our voter who last had meaningful contact with the viewer's life several years ago, or who only knew the viewer during an earlier developmental period, lacks current information regardless of how deep the historical relationship was. The quality of the past relationship does not compensate for the absence of present data. An opinion formed without current information may contain useful historical perspective. It cannot claim current accuracy. Does this voter have relevant expertise in the domain being decided? Emotional significance and domain expertise are separate credentials. The person whose opinion carries the most emotional weight may have no particular competence in the area being considered. Conversely, a former professional contact whose relationship was never emotionally significant may possess precisely the domain knowledge the decision requires. Separating effective authority from epistemic authority is one of the audit's most important functions. Where expertise is absent, the voter may still offer testimony from the perspective of a person who cares about the viewer's well-being, but that testimony cannot substitute for actual knowledge of the domain. Does this voter bear any consequences of the outcome? This question is often clarifying quickly. An absent voter, who will experience no practical change in their daily life regardless of what the viewer decides, has a fundamentally different standing from a person whose material situation is directly affected. Consequence grounds authority. It connects the advisor to the outcome in a way that aligns their interest with accuracy rather than with narrative preference. A voter who bears no consequences can afford to be guided entirely by values, aesthetics, expectations, and identity concerns. Only the person facing the outcome is required by circumstance to weigh practical reality. Does the relationship between the viewer and this voter still actively exist? Former relationships that have naturally concluded, not through conflict, but through the passage of time and diverging lives, occupy a complicated position. The person may have been formative, and the relationship genuinely important. If it no longer functions as an active, reciprocal relationship, the authority it generates is predominantly historical. Historical authority is testimony about who the viewer was in a particular context. It is not current assessment of who the viewer is now, or governance of who the viewer may choose to become. Does the standard this voter enforces align with the viewer's currently chosen values? This is the most internal of the credential questions. It is possible for a voter to have current information, relevant expertise, genuine consequences, and an active relationship, and still be enforcing a standard that the viewer has genuinely, upon examination, chosen not to share. Values can be inherited without being chosen. The audit is not only a review of the voter's credentials. It is a simultaneous review of whether the standard being applied reflects the viewer's actual present values or only the viewer's inherited compliance with someone else's framework. Based on these questions, each voter receives a classification. Some will be clearly identified as offering testimony. Their perspective has genuine value, but their authority over the final decision has expired. Some will be identified as legitimate current stakeholders, whose input belongs near the center. Some will be identified as expired authorities, voices whose credentials have lapsed entirely, whose standards no longer apply, and whose continued influence in the decision constitutes a real cost. Preserving the useful principle from an expired authority voter, separating the wisdom from the ownership, is the next task. But before separation is possible, the verdict itself deserves direct examination. Chapter 9. Cross-examining the verdict. A verdict from the empty gallery typically arrives as a categorical label rather than as a specific, falsifiable statement. Selfish, irresponsible, unrealistic, disloyal, unstable. These are identity categories, not empirical descriptions. Their rhetorical power comes precisely from their vagueness. They cannot be directly refuted because they do not make a precise enough claim to be tested. The first step in cross-examination is translation. What specific, observable behavior would need to be true for this label to be accurately applied? Take the verdict irresponsible. Applied to a career decision, it might mean that the choice would leave dependents without adequate financial provision. It might mean the decision involves an impulsive commitment without adequate risk assessment. It might mean the person would be abandoning obligations already accepted. These are specific, concrete claims, each one examinable against present evidence. Or the verdict might mean none of these things in particular, and might instead be the inherited assessment that a departure from the expected professional trajectory constitutes, by definition, a failure of seriousness, regardless of the practical merits. The translation reveals whether the verdict contains a substantive claim or whether it functions primarily as enforcement language for a category. Disagreement between a viewer and an absent voter is not itself moral failure. One of the gallery's primary operations is converting a difference of preference or value into a verdict about character. The parent who would have made a different choice is not necessarily evidence that the viewer's choice is irresponsible. The former community that would read a departure as disloyalty is not necessarily evidence that genuine loyalty has been violated. The difference of judgment, no matter how strongly felt by the absent voter, describes a difference. It does not by itself establish that the viewer's choice is wrong. Translation of the verdict into a specific claim exposes where the argument actually sits, in a genuine concern about consequence or in a genuine preference about identity. Specific risks embedded in the verdict deserve full acknowledgement. This is not a process designed to dismiss every concern as gallery enforcement. Some of what arrives from absent voters contains real warning. A parent's concern about financial sustainability may reflect accurate observation of a pattern. A former mentor's assessment of a skill gap may describe something real and still relevant. A former partner's accusation, uncomfortable to examine, may contain genuine feedback about a behavioral pattern that has continued through subsequent relationships. The cross-examination is not designed to exonerate. It is designed to distinguish the substantive claim from the identity sentence, to isolate the part of the verdict that refers to something specific and testable from the part that functions only as classification. The career example and the family example together provide useful practice. In the career case, the verdict might be, you are throwing away a secure position for something that will not work. The translation, what specific evidence suggests the alternative will fail? What is the actual risk profile? Not the worst imaginable outcome, but the realistic range of outcomes with probability assessment. What does the viewer's relevant capability suggest about the likelihood of adequate performance? In the family case, the verdict might be you are abandoning the family by considering this relocation. The translation, who specifically is being left without necessary support? What practical arrangements would address legitimate needs? What constitutes abandonment versus lifestyle difference? In each case, the translation moves the verdict from the emotional register of identity accusation to the practical register of specific, evaluable claims. What happens when the verdict, translated carefully, does contain a genuine claim? This is the moment where the cross-examination is most useful. A genuine claim, a specific, realistic risk that the choice would produce a particular harmful outcome, belongs in the deliberation on its own terms. It does not belong as a verdict from an absent authority. The concern can be incorporated as testimony, evaluated against present evidence, and addressed through planning, safeguards, or adjusted timing. The shift from verdict to claim converts the gallery's input from governance into information, which is exactly what it should have been all along. Once the verdict has been translated into a specific claim, the claim can be evaluated against present conditions. This requires gathering an honest picture of the current situation, not the situation as the original authority knew it, not the situation as it was when the verdict was first formed, but the situation as it actually exists at the time of the decision. What has changed? What capabilities have been developed? What resources are now available? What risks have been reduced through preparation, experience, or circumstance? What risks have genuinely increased? Present conditions are the appropriate frame for a present decision, even when the verdict was formed under conditions that were legitimately concerning at an earlier time. Comparing present conditions with the conditions under which the warning originated is often clarifying. The parent who expressed concern about financial risk may have done so when the viewer was younger, with less professional experience, with fewer resources, and with a less developed understanding of the relevant domain. If the concern was appropriate to those earlier conditions, and it may well have been, the question is whether the same concern applies with equal force to present conditions, where all of those variables may have changed substantially. The warning may deserve a modified, rather than wholesale current application. It may identify a risk that remains real, but can be managed differently than it could at the time the warning was issued. Some warnings survive examination intact. This is the most important possibility to allow. A verdict that translates into a specific claim, that the specific claim holds up against current evidence, and that the evidence genuinely supports the concern. This verdict should be weighted accordingly, regardless of its source. The gallery cross-examination does not function as a mechanism for dismissing all inherited concerns. It functions as a mechanism for evaluating them as claims rather than obeying them as verdicts. When the claim survives evaluation, it provides a genuine basis for caution, for adjusted planning, for seeking additional expertise, or for reconsidering the decision's scope or timing. Where the stakes of the decision involve domains requiring expertise the viewer does not possess, seeking qualified counsel is the appropriate response, not because the gallery voter requires it, but because the decision itself requires it. A significant financial decision may warrant consultation with a financial professional. A health-related decision may require medical expertise. A legal arrangement may require legal assessment. These are not acts of submission to gallery authority. They are acts of gathering the current expert testimony that the decision legitimately requires. The distinction between appropriate expertise seeking and gallery compliance is this. Appropriate expertise seeking addresses the actual domain of the decision. Gallery compliance addresses the anticipated reaction of a specific absent voter. What the examination of evidence produces ultimately is a proportionate assessment, a global verdict from the gallery converted into a specific set of concerns, each evaluated at an appropriate weight, with genuine risks acknowledged and managed, and with identity accusations that do not translate into testable claims removed from the decision's center. The person no longer faces a categorical verdict, selfish, irresponsible, unrealistic, as the primary framing of the choice. They face a specific assessment of specific conditions against specific values and specific capabilities. This proportionate assessment can be acted upon. The gallery verdict without translation could only be obeyed or defied. Chapter 10. Removing expired jurisdiction. Removing a vote from the gallery does not require removing the relationship from memory, removing the person from the account, or dismissing what was genuinely learned through the connection. These are separate operations that the emotional intensity of the process can make difficult to distinguish. The removal being described is specifically of governing authority, of the right to determine what the viewer may legitimately choose. It is not a removal of the person's significance, not a removal of relevant wisdom, and not a declaration that the relationship produced no lasting value. Every formative relationship leaves something that can remain after its authority is reviewed. From a parent who valued discipline, what survives is the recognition that sustained effort produces capacity unavailable to impulsiveness, a principle the viewer can now choose because evidence supports it, not because failure to maintain it produces anticipated disapproval. From an early employer who insisted on precision, what survives is the understanding of what careful work actually produces, a standard the viewer can adopt as their own, calibrated to their present professional context, rather than as a compliance with a specific authority's requirements. From a religious tradition whose governance has expired, what survives may be a particular ethic of care, a commitment to something beyond individual interest, or a sense of communal responsibility, principles that can be translated into the viewer's own language and held without the institutional authority that originally framed them. The distinction between principle and obedience is the crucial one here. A principle can be held by anyone who has examined it and found it useful, accurate, and consonant with their chosen values. It belongs to whoever adopts it, regardless of its source. Obedience, by contrast, is defined by its relationship to authority. The behavior continues because an authority requires it, and would change if the authority disappeared or changed its requirements. Most of what the gallery holds is a mixture of genuine principle and compliance with authority. The task of separation is asking, for each standard that has survived the credential review, whether it continues because examination supports it or only because the alternative produces imagined disapproval. Caution, discipline, loyalty, craftsmanship, honesty, care for dependents, these can all survive as chosen values. Their survival does not require preserving the authority of the voter who first enforced them. Rewriting the principle in the viewer's own language is a practical step that makes the separation real rather than theoretical. Instead of, "I maintain discipline because she expected it," the principle becomes, "I maintain discipline because it produces the kind of work I am genuinely proud of." Instead of "I remain loyal because the community would condemn disloyalty," the principle becomes "I remain committed to obligations I have freely entered because integrity in my own relationships matters to me." The content may be similar. The authority has changed entirely. The principle now belongs to the viewer rather than being leased from an absent authority. There is grief in this separation, and it deserves acknowledgement. When influence changes form, when a parent's authority becomes a historical lesson, when a mentor's governance becomes archived expertise, when a community's standards become testimony rather than rule, something real is renegotiated. The relationship to the original authority is not the same after the audit as it was before. Some of what felt like connection was actually compliance, and recognizing that distinction means acknowledging that the connection was partly constructed around a power differential rather than entirely around mutual regard. The grief of that recognition is not evidence that the recognition is wrong. With the testimony archived and the authority reviewed, the audit requires a precise statement of who governs what. This is not a motivational declaration. It is a formal internal record, a line written in the gallery register that assigns responsibility for a specific domain to a specific current authority and defines the role of every other voice in the deliberation. The jurisdiction statement begins with the specific decision domain: career direction in a particular field, choice of residence, structure of a significant relationship, management of personal finances beyond joint obligations, religious or philosophical practice. Each domain is distinct, and jurisdiction can be different across domains. A person may appropriately consult a parent's perspective on family dynamics while holding full jurisdiction over professional decisions. A person may legitimately include a spouse's input in financial planning while holding primary jurisdiction over personal creative practice. Jurisdiction is not a single universal declaration. It is a domain-specific assignment of governing authority. Within the defined domain, the statement names who currently holds primary responsibility for the outcome. This is typically the viewer, the person who will live with the consequences, who has current information, who has the relevant capabilities, and who has examined the values that should guide the choice. It may also include current stakeholders, whose lives are materially affected, whose input the final decision genuinely incorporates. Primary responsibility does not mean isolation from input. It means the final vote belongs here, in the present, with the person bearing the consequences. The statement then names whose input warrants consultation without governance. This category includes people with relevant current knowledge, genuine expertise in the domain, or legitimate concern for the viewer's well-being. It does not include gallery voters whose credentials have been reviewed and found expired. Consultation is a designated role. It means the information is genuinely sought and genuinely incorporated into the deliberation, while the final determination remains with the person who holds primary jurisdiction. An absent voter may still be assigned a consultation role if they possess genuinely useful information. But the assignment is explicit, bounded and chosen, not inherited and automatic. The statement names which absent voices may contribute testimony only. These are voices whose historical relevance the viewer acknowledges, from whom something real was learned, whose concern had genuine basis at some point, but whose direct governing authority has expired. Their voice remains in the record. Their vote is not accepted. The distinction is not punitive, it is functional. The record benefits from the testimony's content while the governance returns to its appropriate location. Guilt and internal protest will arrive. When the jurisdiction statement is first applied to an actual decision, the gallery will respond with the familiar suite of verdict sentences, the accusations of selfishness, disloyalty, ingratitude, recklessness. These responses do not indicate that the jurisdiction statement is wrong. They indicate that the expired authority is responding to its formal limitation. Anticipating the protest does not make it disappear, but it prevents it from being mistaken for evidence. The protest is the gallery's objection to its own review, a self-interested verdict rather than an independent assessment of the decision's merit. What demonstrates that the jurisdiction statement actually governs is not the absence of internal protest. It is behavior that proceeds from the stated authority, despite the protest. Chapter 11. The unobserved experiment. The jurisdiction statement changes the formal internal record. Changing behavior requires something additional, an actual instance of choosing without organizing the choice around its subsequent explanation. The unobserved experiment is the first behavioral test of whether the formal review has genuinely shifted the authority structure, or whether the gallery retains its operational influence despite the review's conclusions. Select a decision that is genuinely low in practical consequence, reversible without significant cost, and contained enough that the outcome can be observed clearly within a reasonable time frame. The experiment is not a life overhaul. It is a calibrated test of the gap between imagined gallery verdict and actual consequence. A short educational course in a domain previously dismissed as unsuitable. A change in how personal time is structured, departing from the pattern the gallery would have endorsed. A creative practice given serious private attention for a defined period. A social context entered without the protective framing of the expected identity. The specific content matters less than the deliberate departure from organizing the choice around its explanation. Avoid announcing the experiment to the primary gallery voters. This is not secrecy. It is simply delaying the disclosure until evidence exists. The difference is significant. Secrecy conceals because the disclosure would produce legitimate harm or violate someone's reasonable expectation. Delayed disclosure withholds information because announcing in advance would contaminate the experiment itself by reintroducing the gallery dynamic into the decision before the decision has produced any results worth discussing. Once the experiment has run its course and its results are observable, disclosure may be entirely appropriate. What the experiment requires is that the first information gathering occur from reality rather than from the imagined gallery verdict. Within the experiment, a specific internal experience will emerge, the urge to justify. Even in the absence of any actual audience, the person conducting the experiment will often notice an impulse to prepare an explanation, to construct a narrative that would make the choice legible to the absent voters, to find framing that would reduce the anticipated verdict. This impulse is the gallery asserting its influence through the mechanism of preemptive self-presentation. Noticing, it is the first productive result of the experiment. The urge to justify in the absence of any actual audience reveals the degree to which the gallery had been generating the justification requirement itself, independent of any external demand. Complete the action. Record what actually happens, the practical consequences, the internal experience, the relational responses if relevant, and the gap between the imagined verdict and the actual outcome. The comparison between what the gallery predicted and what reality produced is the primary data of the experiment. Often the gap is significant. The predicted catastrophe is a modest adjustment. The predicted confirmation of incapacity reveals unexpected competence. The predicted relational rupture becomes a straightforward conversation. These comparisons do not prove that the gallery is always wrong. They provide actual evidence in place of imagined verdicts, and evidence is the foundation on which present tense authority is built. With the first experiment's results in hand, a larger and more consequential test becomes possible. Not a permanent commitment or an irrevocable change, but an action whose scale is sufficient to generate genuine evidence about a possibility that was previously dismissed without investigation. This is not the bounded experiment of a defined short period. It is an actual choice that the person cares about enough for its results to matter, conducted with appropriate safeguards and clear criteria for evaluation. Before the action is taken, define what success and failure would actually look like in measurable terms. Not the imagined success of the gallery's approval or the imagined failure of the gallery's verdict, but the practical markers that would tell an honest observer whether the direction is viable. What specific outcomes would indicate that the choice is producing genuine value? What specific outcomes would indicate that adjustment or reversal is warranted? Defining these criteria before the evidence arrives removes the gallery's opportunity to retroactively interpret the results through its preferred frame, where any difficulty confirms the original warning and any success is attributed to factors other than the viewer's genuine capability. Acknowledge real risks and build proportionate safeguards. The unobserved experiment is not a performance of impulsiveness. Its purpose is to gather evidence that was previously foreclosed by the gallery's anticipated verdict, not to prove a predetermined conclusion. Genuine risks that survive the cross-examination of the verdict belong in the planning. If financial risk is real, the experiment includes a financial boundary. If relational consequence is real, the experiment includes a plan for managing it. If the stakes involve others who are legitimately affected, the experiment includes their appropriate involvement. Safeguards are not evidence of the gallery's authority. They are evidence of the viewer's own judgment operating in the present tense. Record what reality actually says when the gallery's imagined verdict is temporarily displaced. The practical results, what the work actually produces, how the environment actually responds, what capacities are actually engaged or discovered, constitute a new entry in the record. Not the gallery's verdict, not the inherited prediction, the actual consequence of an actual choice made on present grounds. This new entry belongs in the gallery record, not as a refutation of everything that came before it, but as current evidence with appropriate current weight. Here is the private exercise this record offers. Take a moment, away from this narration if needed, with pen and paper if useful, and write the name or role of one absent voter whose reaction still appears early in your most significant current deliberations. Not for anyone else's reading, not as a public declaration, simply as an honest identification of the seat in your gallery that carries the most consistent influence. Knowing the name is the beginning of the credential review. Nothing is required beyond that act of recognition, but the recognition is specific, real, and necessary. Chapter 12. Speaking to the living. The evidence from the experiments now provides a foundation for conversation. When a choice has been made, or when a direction has been sufficiently examined to be worth communicating, the question of how to speak with living people about it arises. The gallery model can distort this conversation in a specific way. It can convert what should be an act of communication into an extended permission ritual, in which the viewer rehearses ever more elaborate justifications for a choice that has already been made on sound grounds. Stating the decision clearly is the first discipline, not the emotional backstory, not the complete rationale, not the anticipatory defense of every imagined objection, the actual decision or direction communicated plainly. I am planning to leave this position by the end of the year. I have decided to pursue this course of study. I am moving toward this arrangement. The clarity of the statement establishes the conversation's register from the beginning. It distinguishes between a disclosure and a negotiation, between informing someone about a choice and asking them to authorize it. Relevant consequences deserve clear communication. If the decision affects another person's practical situation, financially, logistically, relationally, those effects belong in the disclosure, not buried in qualifications, not managed to minimize their apparent weight, but stated honestly as part of the information being shared. A decision about relocation includes honest discussion of how the move affects shared logistics. A career change includes honest discussion of how the transition affects household finances during the transition period. Transparency about practical consequences is not an act of submission to the gallery. It is a straightforward obligation to people whose lives are genuinely touched by the choice. Inviting information from people who are actually affected is different from inviting their authorization. The question, how will this timing work for you, given your schedule, is an information-gathering question that respects a legitimate current interest. The question, do you think I am making the right decision, is a request for authorization that reinstalls gallery dynamics in a present conversation. The distinction in phrasing is small. The distinction in structure is the difference between involving a current stakeholder appropriately and seeking the gallery's approval in a live format. Unaffected people do not require extended explanation. A family member whose daily life is unchanged by the career decision is not owed a complete account of how the decision was reasoned, what alternatives were considered, and why each gallery objection was addressed. Providing that extended account is itself evidence of the permission ritual, of treating the gallery's anticipated verdict as an entitlement to comprehensive justification. The person may receive the information. they do not require the apology that sometimes accompanies it. Explaining why a legitimate choice is legitimate to someone who is not affected by it is not a communication courtesy. It is a deference to gallery authority delivered in person. Relocation, retirement, major career transition, and similar choices that do alter others' contexts require more thorough communication, not because the viewer requires their approval, but because shared contexts require shared information and shared planning. The distinction the gallery confuses is between the practical necessity of communicating a choice's consequences to people who will experience those consequences, and the gallery ritual of seeking validation from people whose reaction is the primary audience. One is an obligation, the other is a continuation of absent voter dynamics in a present tense format. The conversation has been held. The decision has been communicated with clarity. Relevant consequences have been shared, and the appropriate people have had the opportunity to provide genuine input. What arrives next may not be approval. A parent may express disappointment. A sibling may question the decision. A professional colleague may voice skepticism. A close friend may react with confusion or concern. These responses are real. They belong to the people experiencing them. What they do not automatically possess is the authority to reverse the decision or restore the gallery's jurisdiction over it. The first discipline in receiving a difficult reaction is to listen for the information it might contain. Even a critical or emotionally charged response may include something worth hearing, a practical concern that had not been fully considered, a perspective on consequences that improves the decision's implementation, a piece of information about the other person's situation that is relevant to planning. Emotional intensity does not disqualify a response from containing valid information. It does require separating the informational content from the intensity of the delivery, which can be difficult in the moment but is worth the effort. Separating the information from the jurisdiction is the next discipline. The parent's disappointment is real. The disappointment does not constitute a veto. The professional community's skepticism is a real social response. It does not determine the decision's merit. The friend's confusion is genuine. It may simply reflect a difference in values or context rather than an error in the viewer's reasoning. These responses belong to the people who hold them. Receiving them honestly does not require obeying them. The distinction between taking someone's reaction seriously and granting it authority over the final determination is precisely the skill the entire audit has been building toward. Where the delivery of the disclosure was careless, repair is appropriate. If the decision was communicated in a way that was dismissive of a legitimate concern, that triggered unnecessary alarm, or that failed to provide relevant information to someone who needed it, correcting that delivery is a straightforward obligation. It is not the same as withdrawing the decision. An apology for careless communication can coexist with continued movement in the same direction. The repair addresses the relational handling. It does not constitute a reversal of the underlying choice unless the underlying choice itself proves upon examination to have been wrong. Preserve the decision where the evidence still supports it. After the conversation has occurred, after the reaction has been received, after any genuine information in the response has been incorporated, the decision returns to the same grounds on which it was made: present evidence, present values, present consequence, and present stakeholders. If nothing in the conversation has changed the substantive basis for the decision stands, not as a declaration of relational indifference, but as an act of present tense authority. The other person's continued disagreement is possible. Continued disagreement is not the same as a veto, and it does not obligate the viewer to repeat the justification until agreement arrives. Allow the relationship time without repeated pleading. A person who disagrees with a choice is not always processing the disagreement immediately. Some relationships require space for adjustment, for the initial reaction to settle, and for a more considered response to emerge. Repeated explanation, persistent justification, continual checking for signals of approval or forgiveness, these behaviors reinstall the gallery dynamic in a live relationship. They signal that the viewer requires approval before the authority of the choice can be internalized. When the decision has been communicated, the relevant concerns have been addressed, and the choice has been made on sound grounds, the viewer's task is to proceed, allow the relationship time, and remain open to continued connection without requiring that connection to take the form of endorsement. Final chapter: the present electorate. The audit has created space. The empty gallery has been examined, its credentials reviewed, its verdicts translated and tested, its testimony archived, and its jurisdiction formally reassigned. What occupies the space that the gallery's expired authority vacated is not an absence. It is a smaller, more legitimate and more capable deliberative body composed of voices that actually have grounds to participate in present decisions. This is the present electorate, the collection of perspectives, obligations, values and expertise that genuinely belongs in the room when a significant choice is being made. At the center sits the present self, not the performing self calibrating behavior for an absent audience, not the approved self-maintaining descriptions assigned by original authorities, not the past self-protecting old declarations. The self with current information about present conditions, current knowledge of actual capabilities, current experience of actual consequences, and a chosen relationship to values that has been examined rather than merely inherited. This self is not infallible, no center of authority is, but it carries the single credential that no gallery voter can match. It is here, bearing the actual outcome, living in present conditions and responsible for the actual life being built. Current stakeholders belong beside the present self in proportion to their genuine stake. A spouse navigating shared financial obligations is a real participant in financial planning. Dependent children whose daily lives are shaped by parental decisions have legitimate interests that deserve representation in the deliberation, even if their representation takes different forms depending on their age and capacity. A contractual partner, whose professional situation is materially linked to the outcome, has a real claim on the decision-making process. These presences do not diminish the present self's authority. They define the context in which present self-authority is exercised, a context of real relationships with real mutual obligations. Qualified expertise belongs in specific domains where the viewer's own knowledge is insufficient for the stakes involved. This is not deference to gallery authority. It is the honest acknowledgement that good decisions in complex domains require information the viewer does not independently possess. Medical expertise for health decisions, financial expertise for complex structural choices, legal expertise for consequential arrangements. These are not gallery voters. They are current, domain-specific, consequence-bearing advisors whose input improves the quality of present-tense deliberation. Real obligations belong in the room as facts rather than as performances. An obligation that exists because a commitment was freely made and whose consequences of breach would be materially real belongs in the present electorate as a constraint on available choices. This is different from maintaining an obligation because a gallery voter would disapprove of its modification. An obligation maintained because a parent would condemn its revision is gallery compliance in the guise of integrity. An obligation maintained because the people who relied on the commitment would face genuine harm from its breach is genuine integrity, a present tense standard with present tense grounds. Historical lessons that have survived examination remain available as perspective, the principle of sustained effort, the recognition of specific recurring patterns in the viewer's own behavior, the understanding of how certain environments affect performance or well-being. These are not absent voters. They are the distilled, examined inheritance that remains genuinely useful, now held as the viewer's own knowledge rather than as someone else's authority. Reputation without current consequence belongs outside the room. The concern with how a choice will appear to people who bear none of its consequences within a social context that exerts no material power over the viewer's actual conditions does not constitute legitimate deliberative input. It is the gallery's most portable form. The tendency to bring the audience into the room when the credentials review has formally removed it. The present electorate is assembled. The decision can now be made with the full process available. Not the gallery's preemptive verdict, not the permission ritual, not the imagined tribunal. the actual deliberation conducted by the actual participants in the actual present. The vote in present tense is not a guarantee of a correct outcome. No deliberative process can promise that. It is a guarantee that the outcome emerges from the appropriate authority, applied to current facts in service of chosen values. State the decision using current facts. Not the historical narrative that the gallery would use to frame it, not the defensive framing that the permission ritual would require, but the actual question being decided in its actual present form. A career transition, a geographic change, a relational shift, a financial commitment, a creative pursuit, stated as specifically as the decision actually exists, with its actual conditions and actual constraints. Precision at this stage prevents the deliberation from being contaminated by the gallery's preferred framing of the stakes. State the value guiding the decision. Which of the viewer's genuinely chosen values, examined, tested, and claimed as their own, applies most directly to this choice? Not the value assigned by the original authority, not the value enforced by the collective, not the value declared by the past self before further evidence was gathered, but the value the viewer would endorse upon examination in the present moment. Naming the value explicitly prevents the deliberation from being conducted on undeclared grounds that turn out upon closer inspection to belong to an absent voter rather than to the person making the choice. State the consequences to stakeholders, honestly and specifically. Who is affected and how? What obligations are being honored? And what adjustments are being made to existing relationships and arrangements? This is not the extended justification of the permission ritual. It is the factual accounting of how the choice intersects with other people's genuine interests, the accounting that a person with present tense authority conducts because it is part of responsible decision-making, not because the gallery requires it. Name the absent verdict without obeying it. The gallery will have produced its anticipated response by this point. The parent's voice is present in the room. The former partner's assessment has arrived. The collective standard has registered its disapproval. These are not surprises. The audit identified them and reviewed their credentials. They belong here, named and acknowledged, stripped of jurisdiction. The viewer can say, internally and precisely, I hear this verdict. I know its source. I have reviewed its credentials. I understand what it is trying to protect and where its authority ends. It will not govern this outcome. Choose a proportionate next action. Not the entire direction at once, not the permanent declaration, but the specific next step that moves in the direction the deliberation has supported. A decision is operationalized through action, and action generates the next round of evidence. The proportionate next action keeps the decision in contact with reality rather than in the realm of intention. The opening document of this record returns here. The choice that was sitting unsigned, the form that was being rehearsed against an absent audience, the decision whose first movement was a gallery verdict rather than a present tense assessment, that document is now in different hands. The same hands that were always holding it, the same person who was always responsible for its contents. The difference is that the room is smaller now, and its occupants have credentials that hold. Epilogue. When the gallery empties, the old verdict arrives again. It tends to, not as a sign that the process has failed, but as a sign that the gallery's architecture was deep enough that revision requires more than a single review. The imagined face, the familiar sentence, the accumulated weight of the original authority's standards, these reappear at the moment of action, offering their familiar evaluation of a choice already made through careful deliberation. The question is not whether the verdict returns, the question is what it is now classified as. The viewer who has conducted the audit recognizes the arrival, not with the automatic compliance of a person who has not yet examined the credentials, and not with the automatic dismissal of a person performing independence rather than practicing it. The verdict returns as testimony from a specific source operating under specific conditions with specific credentials that have been reviewed. It is acknowledged as what it is, a perspective from someone who mattered, whose standards shaped the formation of the self, whose concern may have been genuine, and whose authority to determine the present outcome has been formally reviewed and found expired. The action proceeds. Not without the verdict's presence. The verdict is there, and the emotional weight of years behind it is real. But the vote does not determine the outcome. The document is signed, the step is taken, the direction is maintained, and the person who takes it is not waiting for unanimous internal approval before moving. Unanimous internal approval from a gallery assembled over decades of conditional belonging is not a precondition for action. It was never available, and the expectation that it might arrive was itself a form of gallery authority. One more mechanism for keeping the final vote in absent hands. What happens to the gallery when its jurisdiction has been reviewed? The seats do not disappear, the nameplates remain. The record of each relationship, each standard, each correction, each formative encounter. These belong in the archive because they are part of the actual history of the self. The empty gallery continues to exist as part of the record. What changes is not its existence but its function. A gallery of witnesses is a different institution from a gallery of voters. The witnesses can remain. The ballot box closes. Absent people can continue to occupy a place in the viewer's ongoing understanding of themselves without possessing automatic authority over what the viewer may choose next. A parent whose standards shaped an early self can remain a significant part of that history without receiving a veto over a retirement decision made at 60. A former partner whose verdict installed a durable self-concept can remain part of the account of how that self-concept was formed without governing the structure of a new relationship 30 years later. The relationship between the formative experience and the present choice is acknowledged, and it stops there, at acknowledgement, without extending into jurisdiction. Maturity in this framework is neither the complete independence of a self that formed without influence, nor the permanent compliance of a self organized entirely around accumulated authority. It is the capacity to carry influence consciously, to know whose voice is speaking, to understand what it was responding to honor what in it deserves honoring, and to make the present choice on present grounds without requiring the absent audience's endorsement for the action to feel legitimate. This is what it means for the gallery to empty. Not that the seats are destroyed, but that the ballot box is no longer open to people who are not here. Before this session closes, a single honest question is worth sitting with. Among the 4 categories of absent voter, this record has examined the original authority whose early standards installed the deepest behavioral rules, the former intimate whose access to private territory gave their verdict unusual persuasive weight, the collective whose standards operated as ambient pressure without a visible spokesperson, and the past self whose earlier declarations created the internal requirement for consistency. Which category has held the most consistent authority inside your most significant current decisions? There is no answer that exempts anyone from the credential review, and no answer that requires dramatic action. The recognition itself is the beginning of the change in governance. This record has examined one kind of empty room, the ceremonial gallery, where absent people continue to vote despite no longer being present. There is a related empty room that a different volume will open, quieter and in some ways more difficult because its architecture looks like peace. Where this gallery is loud with imagined verdicts, the next room is characterized by a silence that has been mistaken for resolution. 2 people in a relationship, long past their most difficult period, who have stopped fighting and have also stopped reaching. The absence of conflict confused for the presence of connection. That investigation into what the absence of noise actually contains belongs to the quiet register, and it begins where this one ends.